Thanks very much. So I'm excited to have the opportunity to highlight some of the music in the Andres Segovia archive. The archive is a series of compositions that were written for Segovia during his lifetime, but that were not published, and that at the time of his death in 1987 were in his studio in Madrid. The Italian guitarist, composer, and musicologist Angelo Gilardino, in his role as the head of the Segovia Foundation, published a series of the compositions that were found in the archive. And that's what I'm going to be drawing on today, the published manuscripts that are available for us to explore. These lesser-known works represent a significant contribution to the solo guitar repertoire of the 20th century, as well as an enrichment of the legacy of Segovia as the sort of father of the modern guitar. So I wanted to start with a quote from Segovia. He said, "I spend my life asking everyone for pieces for my guitar. Rejecting some of them is something that causes me real pain." This was a letter to the French composer Henri Collet, whose music is actually represented in the archive with one piece as well. And I think all of us here probably know that one of Segovia's main contributions when his career was getting started, or one of his goals, was to try to get music written for the guitar. At that point, the repertoire consisted of a lot of transcriptions and 19th century works, and it's particularly after his Paris debut in 1924 and his subsequent success in Europe, he attempted to get the leading composers of his day to write for the guitar. Maybe another thing that we all know is that Segovia's musical taste was relatively conservative for that era, the 1920s, of course, the era of atonality and 12-tone music and all kinds of new and strange things happening in the composition world. But Segovia favored a much more sort of romantic or post-romantic style. And some of the pieces that are present in the archive represent a more modern sort of voice. Some of them are clearly intended for Segovia's taste, and some are a little bit outside of that comfort zone. A piece that is a good reference point maybe would be the Frank Martin 4 short pieces, which famously he wrote in the 1930s, I think it was, and Segovia didn't play it, and then it was sort of revived by Julian Bream, and now is very much a standard part of the repertoire. And there's several pieces in this archive that are of a similar vein, maybe not always as modern of a language, but similarly kind of interest as like a different sort of path for guitar composition in the 20th century. So the way I'm going to structure this lecture is sort of in 3 parts. I'm going to start with a history of the Segovia archive, how it came about, and the process of publication. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about, kind of dip in and out of specific pieces to talk about some of the performance considerations that arise. One of the great things about the published archive, for those who know it, is that they include copies of the manuscripts of the composers, so we can see there's a very nice, clean, modern edition with fingerings, and then you can look at what's actually was in the archive, and there's sometimes are decisions to make about chord voicings, octave displacement, and I'll talk a little bit about some of the things that the editors did and highlight some of those possibilities. And finally, at the end, I'm going to just talk about 2 or 3 specific works from the archive and play a little bit, just so you can, after all this talk, hear a little bit of what this music sounds like. So, to start about the history of the archive itself, the Italian guitarist and composer and scholar Angelo Gilardino was named the artistic director of the Andres Segovia Foundation in 1997, and just a few years later, with the blessing of Segovia's family, was able to go into the materials that were in Segovia's studio in Madrid when he died. They were taken to Linares, Segovia's birthplace, and the location of the foundation and museum, and to go through the materials. I won't talk much about Gilardino himself. There was a wonderful lecture the other day by Luigi here, so hopefully you heard a little bit about his compositions already. But Gilardino is the general editor of the series and put together, along with some other guitarists and scholars, the materials that are available to us. So the archive was opened in May of 2001, so a little over 20 years ago. Another thing that guitarists maybe are already aware of is that Segovia had mentioned in a letter to the Mexican composer Ponce a series of works by leading European composers that he had in his studio and was planning to play, and he mentions specific works by Cyril, Scott, and others. And it had been assumed for a long time that these works were lost when Segovia's house was ransacked at the beginning of the Spanish Civil War, his house in Barcelona. But when Gilardino opened the archive in 2001, he immediately discovered most, if not all, of those pieces. I think there's just a couple of outliers that we think are probably lost, but a lot of the major works that were almost sort of a mythical status at that point did turn up in the archive, and he subsequently published them. So the materials themselves, there were 12 cases of material, and this contained these manuscripts that were eventually published in the archive, in addition to a lot of other material, photocopies of scores, even scores that Segovia had purchased just from, like anyone would purchase them with his markings on them, copies of, multiple copies of the same piece. So there's a lot of other material that, it should be said, is not published as part of this series. There's a wonderful catalog that was put together by Luigi Attademo in the magazine Rosetta, Spanish guitar magazine, that you can find online, that lists the contents of what was in there. But I'm going to restrict my discussion today to the published scores themselves, and things that are widely available to us to explore and hopefully to play. One of my hopes is that this lecture will expose some of us that maybe are unfamiliar with some of this music to some of the treasures that are in there. Gilardino does mention in one of the articles he wrote about this that there were some compositions in the archive that he chose not to publish. He gives one anecdote of an amateur composer who used to come to Segovia's concerts, and every time he would come through town, he would go to him after the concert and hand him a new manuscript piece of music, but they were not really of professional quality, so he chose not to publish those. And there are a couple, I was just talking to Al beforehand, a couple of outlier pieces like by Pachmann, the son of Vladimir de Pachmann, I believe, the famous pianist piece that is not published as part of the series. There's one piece too by Ignaz Strasvogel that's not published as part of the Berben edition of the Segovia archive, but I believe it is published by, it's a German publication, so that piece is also available. And again, I encourage you, if you're interested in sort of the more general archive beyond just these pieces, to seek out that article by Luigi that catalogs some of the materials that are in there. So just generally about, again, I'm restricting this discussion to the published material that's available. And again, Gilardino is the general editor. There's some other editors that are involved in particular scores as well. There's 33 volumes in the series, all published by Berben, starting at the opening of the archive and up till the year 2015. Each of the volumes, as I mentioned, contains the manuscript at the back, so and I'll show some examples of this in a minute, so you can see in the composer's hand what was there. There's even cases where, I think it's in the Cyril Scott Sonatina, you can see Segovia's annotations of how he was revoicing some of the chords. That's a really wonderful resource in itself that is part of this series. And they also include scholarly introductions, usually by Gilardino. There's a biographical sketch of the composer, because many of these composers are less known to us today. They're prominent European composers from the 20s, 30s, and 40s that we don't know as much about today, so it's very useful. And then a discussion of the piece itself, how it came about, sometimes a discussion of editorial decisions that went into the changes that need to be made to make the pieces playable in some cases, and I'm going to give some specific examples of that in a second here. And again, the music, generally speaking, that's in the published version of the archive is really primarily by European composers. There's one piece by a Colombian composer and a piece from the US, but in general it's European composers, and at least for the recording that I've been preparing, I focus very much on the music of the 20s and 30s, this particularly rich era, right after Segovia had sort of made his name on the European stage, when really all of the big names in France and England and Belgium and Switzerland were wanting to write music for Segovia, and there's some really rich and interesting repertoire that comes out of that period. There's some familiar names for guitarists in there. Music by Lennox Barkley, a very early piece from, I think it's the 1920s, or we can't nail down the exact date, but of course a wonderful composer of lots of guitar music that we all know and love, but a new set of 4 pieces that are really wonderful and interesting. There's a piece by Castelnuovo Tedesco in the manuscript. It's the homage to Boccherini, and Gilardino presents the manuscript, which is quite different from the published version, so it almost allows for a new version of the piece. A piece by Montpou, a large set of pieces by Alexander Tansman, a set of posthumous works that includes, I think it's 5 previously unknown solo works for guitar, as well as sonatine. It's for solo guitar, but it's impossible, and they sort of transformed it into a really wonderful guitar duo. A new piece by Toroba, so some familiar names in the mix. And then, like I said, pieces by European composers who were very prominent at that time, but maybe are a little bit less well known to us today. One of the big ones, or one of the first big discoveries, and a piece I'm going to talk more about at the end, by Cyril Scott, great English composer, who's known as the English Debussy, and has a style that uses a lot of the same techniques as Debussy, whole tone scales and pentatonic and kind of sliding chromaticism, really wonderful sonatina that was a major discovery. I listed here Pierre Octave Ferrou, another piece that I worked on. That he was a friend of Francis Poulenc, and actually the language is somewhat more in that vein. So some really interesting works by largely unknown composers from that era of the 20s and 30s. And actually, I'll back up here in a second, but here I realize you can't really see this too well, but just to give you a sense of the breadth of music, and as this is a alphabetical list by composer of all of the works in the published archive with the country and date. I should say too, if you're interested in any of this material, you can get in touch or email, and I'll happily. It's an Excel file. You can sort of look at it and sort it as you like, but it gives you an idea of kind of the quantity of music and the general era that we're talking about. I mentioned that one of the big discoveries, or one of the primary sources of interest for me, was the music in this that followed Segovia's great triumph in Paris in 1924. And there's a series of works that come right after that concert. Some of the ones that I investigated a little more with the Raymond Petit Sicilienne, really wonderful piece. He has another solo piece, I believe, as well. The Pierre de Breville Fantasy from 1926. That's a piece that's been recorded a little bit more than some of the others, and is really a very virtuosic and exciting piece. I mentioned the Ferrou has one piece called Spiritual from 1926, which is also really fascinating, a little bit more of a modern kind of musical language that we don't have a lot of music like that from that era. A large suite by Raymond Moulier from 1926. And Henri Martelly, 4 pieces from the 1930s, another, to me, one of the major discoveries from the archive. It's a longer, major work, very virtuosic, and again, in a language that we don't often encounter in solo guitar music of that era. Just to go back here also, just to talk very briefly about recordings that are available, and there are particular pieces like the Cyril Scott Sonatina, the Lennox Barkley 4 pieces, and a few others. There are a number of recordings out there. As far as I'm aware, maybe if anyone knows differently, please let me know. There's one sort of complete recording of the published archive by the Italian guitarist Ermanno Brignolo, who's a student of Gilardino. Roberto Moron Perez has also done, I think it's 3 CDs of music taken from the archive that are really wonderful. He also worked on some of the pieces, I believe, and has written some of the introductions that are in there. Luigi Attademo has a recording from, I think, just after the archive, which is like 2002, so that has some of the major works from there. And Martha Masters also has a disc of the Spanish works, and she recorded the Gilardino. There's a tribute piece to Segovia by Gilardino that's from the 2000s that she's recorded as well. So recordings-wise, there's some representation, but to me it's a bit of an unexplored territory. It's something that I think that I'd love to, part of my goal of this was to get this music out there and hopefully encourage people to investigate it for themselves. So the next section of the lecture here is going to be about performance considerations, and like I said, the published editions include a really nice, clean, modern edition with fingerings and editorial decisions to make the pieces, playable as like a copy you can read off the music stand. But they also include the original manuscript so that guitarists can look for themselves what was actually in the original, and you can make your own decisions in some cases about how you want to interpret what's there. Some of the editorial changes, as I listed, are quiet editorial changes, revoicings of chords or displacement of octaves for things that are physically unplayable, and they don't mention it specifically, but Gilardino and others change those chords to make them playable. And I know there's a bunch of people here who work with living composers who are not guitarists. I should say the majority of the music in the archive is by non-guitarist composers, and it's always, of course, an issue for someone who doesn't play the guitar how to write idiomatically, or even in some cases they'll send you chords that are physically impossible, and you help them to kind of to make it work. And there's a lot of that kind of editing work that goes into these scores. Sometimes, and in many cases, these editorial changes are spelled out in the introductions or even in the scores themselves, so that you can see exactly what they decided to do. And what I'd like to do is just to take you through a few examples of what this looks like, what kind of changes they made, and in some cases, places where you can change from the published score and it results in a fairly different kind of sound. So the first example, I'm not going to play a recording of this one, but just to give an example of some of the types of changes or some of the more major changes that sometimes happen with this music. This is a piece by Pajisa, a great Spanish composer, and I believe this piece is from 1919, which is one of the exciting things about it. It's a year before Manuel de Falla's Homenaje, so a very early Spanish 20th century guitar work written for Segovia, the Cansao and El Mar. But as you can see in the manuscript on the left here, it's written in grand staff, treble clef, bass clef, and it says at the top for piano or guitar. And it really looks pretty much like a piano score. And so in the edited version that's in the published edition, as you can see here, they transposed the key. It's originally in G major in the grand staff, and the guitar version here is presented in D major. So a major editorial decision, and again, not something that was not very unusual. One thing we know is the Segovia Ponce letters, all these indications of how Segovia would take music by Ponce and others and almost recompose it in some cases, transpose sections, move things around. But this, I think, is a case of just to make the piece work a bit better on the guitar. The next example by another Spanish composer, Gaspar Casado. This is from two popular Finnish songs. This is the second of the two songs. And here's the case, and this Gilardino spells out this change in his notes at the beginning of the edition. That there's, you can see on the right side here, the red star, that's the end of the piece. And that corresponds to the red star there in the manuscript. And as you can see, there's a whole new section at the end of the piece that Gilardino opted to omit from the published score, and basically for musical reasons, saying that it's not an affected end to the piece. And I've searched out as many recordings of this piece as I can find. I haven't found anyone who does add that section back in, so it's an interesting sort of addition that could be explored with this piece. So I'm going to just play a brief recording. This is Hermano Brignolo's recording, which adheres to the version on the right here. And this excerpt starts right after the fermata there, so the third measure on that page. Clean ending, and then a series of slower strummed chords deemed not worthy of inclusion here, so something you could explore if you wanted to try that piece. The next example I have by the French composer Henri Martelly, the four pieces, which again to me is one of the really major discoveries from the archive. Really wonderful piece, very virtuosic, and also in just a fascinating sort of different language from what we're accustomed to. Here's an example of an editorial change that's very clearly marked in the score, and that is it is definitely, it's almost like an ossia. In the original score, you can see my red circle there in the manuscript. This passage of 8/16 notes, which is way up high on the guitar. I think it goes up to a high A there. And this, as you'll hear in a second, it's a hyper virtuoso, this second movement really fast, and it's pretty difficult to get that to speak and work in the context. So in the published score over here, the red circle, they take that passage down an octave, but again, specify the octave change, so if you want to try that. And this is something that different players take a different way. I'm going to start with a recording of Brignolo again, who does take that higher octave, so you can kind of hear the difference here. And this is starting, if you're following the manuscript, it's right at the top of the, actually both of them start right at the top of the page here. And then here is Roberto Moron Perez, same passage, but with the edited version, those 8 notes down the octave, so you can hear how it sounds different. Yeah, so yeah, really some hot playing there too, and yeah, you get the idea that the change there does make a sort of substantive difference, and really both are workable for sure. The next example I have is a little bit more of a different situation to me. This is from the Raymond Petit Sicilienne for guitar. This is a kind of a slower, more lyrical work. This is actually from the very end of this piece, about a 5 or 6 minute piece. Petit, I should say, is a French composer who I believe wrote one other solo work for guitar, a nocturne. And this is again from the end of the piece, and you can see the circled bits here that are different in the manuscript. Those 2 16th notes, E and C sharp, taken down an octave in the published version here. In the second line there, those 2 thirds, it's an E major chord with sort of separated into 2 sets of thirds. In measure 72 over here, changed to single notes on top there for the melody. And then maybe most audibly or most notably, the chord at the bottom, big E major chord that right before the very end of the piece, which has a high E on top in the published version, high B on top. And I'm not sure if that was an editorial decision or an oversight, but it really does sort of change the effect of the way that ending comes across. And again, I've got a couple of recordings queued up here. First, we'll hear Hermano Brignolo, who does the manuscript version. It adheres to what's in the original. And again, now Roberto Moron Perez, same passage, and with the editorial changes on your right. So again, an example of something that's not indicated in the edition, that change, and it's something I think worth consideration for the player. This is one of the pieces that I recorded. I did the manuscript version there too, kept those original octaves as they are. I have one more of these examples before I go a little bit more in depth into particular pieces and play a little bit. This is from the Pierre de Breville Fantasy. Pierre de Breville is a French composer. And this is one of the ones, the title, Fantasy, I think is an editorial title. The piece is actually untitled in the manuscript. One of my favorite pieces from the archive, really a wonderful piece. This is from a sort of middle slow section in the piece. And just so you can see the changes here, this to me is an example of an editorial change that seems like a good one and not in need of alteration, but it's just interesting to see that process. This is another one they don't mention this change. It's a silent editorial decision here. You can see on the manuscript at the top, the red circle, the low note E, which would be like your second fret, fourth string E there, sustaining all through those first three measures, which Gilardino changes to a low open E, which seems like an obvious choice. They're much more resonant, much easier to get it to ring through. So a change that perhaps Segovia might have asked for had he played this piece too. And a couple of more sort of subtle changes. The second chord there at the top, the circled chord, it's a little hard to read. It's a C sharp major chord there, and it's got a G sharp in the middle there, the middle voice, which is omitted in the edited score over here. This is a chord that we could play that G sharp. It's not a technical decision really to not play that note. It's just to make it a little bit of a cleaner voicing, I think. And then the third example down there, another kind of subtle change. In the edited version, over the sustaining C sharp, there's F sharp and B sharp. But in the original, you can see over here, there's an A sandwiched in between there, which really does change the sound of that chord. It makes it a little bit richer and more chromatic. I experimented with playing the chord in the original way, but it is a bit of a handful to make it work. It's possible, but quite awkward. So that was sort of a judgment call, I think. And again, one where, at least in published recordings, everyone I've heard adheres to Gilardino's edit here. So here's Roberto Moran Perez version of that passage. There's obviously many others. There's 33 volumes, and we could talk about each one. There's just a couple of other brief examples. There's a piece by Raúl La Parra called Cuadros, really wonderful early Spanish piece. Another example of a pretty dramatic editorial intervention. I think the first movement of that piece was found in the archive with no composer's name on it. It was like an anonymous composition. And through some scholarly sleuthing, they determined that it was by La Parra and was intended as part of a suite called Cuadros, Scenes of Spain. And the other two movements existed only in a solo piano version, so Gilardino made a transcription of those two movements to sort of reconstitute the suite. The other one, I think I mentioned earlier, the Tansman. There's a large collection of music by Tansman in the archive, really a wonderful composer that I'm sure we all know. And that sonatine that I mentioned, which is at least conceived for solo guitar, but like so many guitar works, is really physically not possible to play the way that it's written. And what they decided to do is to turn it into a guitar duo version that I believe was recorded by Solo Duo. A really wonderful piece, and I think it works brilliantly. They're able to really maintain all of the original voices. All right, so for the final sort of portion of the lecture here, I wanted to play a little bit to hopefully get a little bit of an idea of kind of what's in the archive and the nature of the music, but to talk a little more specifically and just to hear a little in person what some of this stuff sounds like. And I thought I would start with the Sonatina by Cyril Scott. Well, like I said, one of the major discoveries from the archive, one of the first sort of pieces that emerged from it when it was announced in 2001. I mentioned earlier, Cyril Scott was known as the English Debussy, and he was a rough contemporary of Benjamin Britten, born a bit earlier, but lived in the same era. And it's not a bad description of the way, certainly this piece often sounds. It does use, like I said, lots of whole tone scale passages, lots of pentatonic writing that is reminiscent of Debussy's language, lots of chords, seventh chords that slide chromatically around with almost non-functionally, like in the manner of Debussy or early jazz. Cyril Scott was an important composer of the sort of, particularly in the early part of the 20th century, wrote operas and symphonies and piano sonatas and all kinds of things. He also was interested in alternative medicine and published a couple of books about alternative cancer treatments, kind of an interesting guy. But this piece, the Cyril Scott Sonatina, again in the 1920s era, right after Segovia's Paris debut and subsequent concerts in London, almost certainly Scott heard Segovia live and was inspired to write this piece. And I think I mentioned this one earlier, that it was one of the pieces that was assumed to be lost when Segovia's house was ransacked in the Spanish Civil War, was recovered from the archive right when it was first opened. And was performed just a few months later by Julian Bream in its sort of very belated premiere. Some people might be aware that was in a very revised version of the piece, particularly the third movement, which does appear to be a little bit in process, perhaps not complete, or I think there's a note that Cyril Scott wrote sort of apologizing for that it wasn't quite finished yet. So Bream revised that final movement in a pretty dramatic way, adding sections, repeating things, I think bringing back material from the first movement. There's a wonderful recording of that version of it by Graham Anthony Devine on Naxos that you can seek out. And we also have evidence that Segovia probably did perform the first movement of this piece. There's a program from 27, 28, that has a piece called Reverie by Cyril Scott, and it's speculation, but I am inclined to agree that probably was the first movement of the sonatina. Like I said, the manuscript has some of Segovia's markings in it as if he was working on the piece and sort of making little edits to it. So what I'd like to do, I'm going to play just the first movement, which is the longest of the three movements. It is in a sort of loose sonata form. It doesn't adhere to sort of classical harmonic sonata form principles, but it's got a very clear sort of slow introduction, an exposition with two contrasting themes, a development and a recapitulation. So it has that sort of almost pseudo-classical feeling to it, but again with this almost Debussy-like harmonic language. I'm going to put up here, this is the first 2 pages of the manuscript in case you want to follow along a little bit while I'm playing, but so I'll switch here and just play this first movement. Thank you. I can see I'm running out of time a little bit here, so maybe I'll just really quickly talk about this last piece that I wanted to just at least play a little bit of. And the other one I selected is by Fernand Peron, a wonderful Swiss composer who also has written a couple of other published works for guitar. But there was a theme and variations found in the archive that Segovia never played that to me is again one of the sort of major discoveries from the collection. Peron, just very briefly, again, a Swiss composer, contemporary of Frank Martin, probably the Swiss composer that guitarists know best, or maybe Hans Haug. She studied with Paul Dukas in Paris, and then returned and spent her career in Geneva, where she was a teacher and a composer and choir director. And that's probably where she encountered Segovia. Segovia spent quite a bit of time in Geneva, and I think it's the 1930s. I mentioned these two other published guitar works, the Petite Suite, which was written for Aspiazu, who lived in Geneva, and four preludes from 1986. This particular piece, probably written in the 1930s, can't be dated precisely, but a theme with 6 variations. The final variation is a fugue, which in the manuscript there's 2 versions of it. There's a sort of an earlier version, and then what appears to be a sort of revision, which is the version that Gilardino adopted for this edition, a little bit more complex and rich, that final variation. So maybe I'll stop talking and I'll try my best to squeeze in all these movements. So this is the Peron theme and variations. And again, I'll leave up a couple of pages, the first 2 pages of the manuscript, so you can sort of see what it looks like. This, I should say, is one of the manuscripts that really requires almost no revision, very clean, and really works on the guitar basically as presented.